Smoke filled the room, swirling and mixing with the pungent smell of body odor and alcohol. The haze came from the many varieties of cigars, cigarettes, and other burning drugs. There were many ponies in the tavern. Most of them bared scars, and others covered themselves in cloaks to hide their flanks or deformities. The bartender was one of the few who actually had a cutie mark, but he possessed a set of antlers on his head. One of them was broken in half. The waitress had a large round plate strapped to her back to hold drinks and empty beer glasses. She was often given crude and sexually disturbing remarks that went along with hoof slaps to her flank by the patrons of the Muck and Buck Tavern. But she didn't mind so long as she was well tipped and well paid. Her favorite customers were the few mercenaries who actually had manners towards mares, and the one strange stallion who always wore a dark cloak. She always knew it was him from the single black stripe through his short white tail. He was here tonight, eavesdropping on a conversation in the booth behind him. While he listened, he began to examine some metal tools that were attached to a small holster on his foreleg. The cigarette in his mouth added to the pollution of the bar's climate.
So you know that Count Marcus, the high and mighty auctioneer in Canterlot?
The pale blue unicorn with the dark-colored mane said to his companion, who was sitting across from him. The Pegasus retorted with a disgusted snort.
Yeah, that rich son of a bitch thinks he's better than every pony else.
The green Pegasus scratched at some fleas in his dirty white mane while he listened.
Well, CJ and the boys are planning on a heist. It took a bit of convincing, but I got every pony to agree we'd like you to join us. The pay's gonna be big.
He grinned. The Pegasus lifted an eyebrow in curiosity.
Oh yeah? Anything specific we'd be going after?
Smirking, the unicorn's horn began to glow a dull white as he levitated a scroll out of one of his saddlebags.
Yep, we got a source that says he has something special hidden away in the slave stables next to the mansion. It's supposed to be worth a fortune.
He rolled the scroll out on the table to show his companion.
Right there.
He pointed to a crudely drawn square that was next to a much larger rectangle that was supposed to represent the massive building.
It's in the corner, hidden in a box of some sort. That's why he always has his slaves so heavily guarded.
A box? Really?
The Pegasus responded.
That's not very descriptive intel.
He whipped his tail and took a swig of his beer before continuing.
You guys have very poor scouts, to say the least. But I'll take a nip. What's it supposed to be?
The unicorn waved a hoof in the air.
I'm not really sure, they didn't tell me, but I did hear it was supposed to belong to whoever became the ruler of the Crystal Empire way back when. Royalty riches or something.
The unicorn took a gulp of his own mug of alcohol and watched his friend's face turn to a frown.
You want me to join you guys just to get a box with unknown contents in it?
The Pegasus's ears went flat as he continued to argue his point to his companion. He couldn't understand how it was going to be a big profit when they didn't even know what was inside the box to begin with. The hooded pony that had been eavesdropping was no longer in his seat. He had already left, dropping off his empty cup and a nice tip to the waitress mare before exiting through the doors. As he left the heavy, dank, smoke-filled air of the tavern, he was greeted by the chilled air of the frozen midnight. Thick, dark clouds covered the moon and stars as they threatened to rain and thunder. The pony looked up to the night sky for a moment before starting out. Around him were all manner of swamp growth and decayed woodlands. Night creatures, timber wolves, bats, and mosquitoes roamed about the small town that the other ponies in the bar called home. There were several small shacks built with rubbish, rotting wooden planks, and broken signs that anyone could tell were stolen from another town. A couple of the larger buildings were fortified with firepower, automatic targeted weaponry, but also carried a large sign of the building's name. Crowfoot's Crap Shack and Doc Maggot's Slice and Dice were among the few other shops in the town. Every building was connected with a creaky boardwalk that would carry each pony safely above the crocs that resided in the muddy swamp below. As he walked through the twists and turns of the boardwalk, he finally came to a stretch of the wooden platform that straightened out and led to land. The very end of it was buried into the dirt. Once his hooves reached the soil, he decided to pick up his pace and trot. He continued until he was at the edge of the forest, but not visible to anyone in the closest town. He looked around. No pony in sight. He decided it was best to keep cautious and stay to the tree line until he was as close as he could get to his destination. He passed a small cottage that had a makeshift bridge over a creek and began to see structures that appeared to be half-assed walls, only smaller, with sticks pointing to the outside of town. They were some sort of war barrier. As he continued, they became more frequent, as did the weaponry for their defense. There were a few ponies roaming here and there with large weaponry strapped to their backs and saddlebags on their flanks that held large amounts of ammo. There wasn't any actual wall to this town, but barriers made of various metal scraps attached in between the buildings to create a barrier between the town and the outside world. Unfortunately for them, there were lots of holes in their makeshift wall. A large tree almost in the center of town seemed to be their lookout tower. The tree seemed to have been hollowed out to build the structure inside of it so it would be disguised. A platform, large light, and weaponry could be seen at the very top branches. The stallion trotted until he spotted his target, a train station. Making sure there was no pony around first, he took a hoof and pulled his hood down farther before casually walking out of the foliage and through a hole blown into the wall by explosives several months ago. This town was a bit more refined. None of the buildings were rotting, and there weren't any creatures here that could attack you, but a lot of the buildings were partially destroyed. Here and there were blood stains and bullet shells that barely shone in the night. The occasional body of a pony was lying in the streets either dying or dead. The stallion paid them no mind. They were no threat to him, and thankfully there were no guard ponies in sight. He entered the station of the ticket counter, which had no pony at it.
Of course.
The stallion thought to himself.
Not at this hour.
He looked around and saw a machine next to the counter. It was a dull rusted gray in color and had 2 slots. He had seen one before, though not every train station had one. He grabbed a bit out of his saddlebag and stared at it for a moment. The train could be heard in the distance, getting closer, its brakes squealing in defiance to stop the metal beast, and he knew he had to hurry up. Begrudgingly, he put it in the top slot. The machine responded with a click and a beep before spitting a ticket out at him. Grabbing the ticket with his teeth, he walked out to the train. He stepped through the open doors and gave the ticket to a pony who wouldn't let him pass until he did so. The ticket pony gave a bitter look to the hooded stallion as he walked onto the passenger section of the train. There were a few others on the train at this hour which the stallion wasn't happy about. He'd prefer an empty car. Knowing he couldn't do anything about it, he chose a seat farthest away from any other ponies but as close to the door as he could manage. He sat down and peered out the window. The train pony was outside looking around for any more passengers who wished to board. When no others came, he hopped back on and closed the doors. The train lurched forward before it was able to start on the tracks at a slow speed. The lurch caused the stallion to almost hit the empty seat in front of him, but he caught himself before doing so. A rat fell out of his hood from the jerk of the metal caravan. The rat was sleeping on his neck quite nicely before the abrupt wake-up call. The stallion put his hood down and held the terrified rat. She was a pure black color, well-fed, and had a very clean, shiny coat. She shivered before beginning to embarrassingly clean her face.
Sorry about that, thief. I forgot.
The stallion said to the rat. His ears went back and he smiled at his friend while he petted her. She stood on her hind legs and put her paws on his dark-colored nose and began to lick him as if to say, "It's okay, I forgive you." The train ride was long, and for most of it the stallion stared out the window. His deep blue eyes watching the world around the train passed by in a flash. He caught the occasional limping pony or dilapidated building, but nothing too interesting for this hour of the night. His little black friend had begun to explore their new surroundings as she'd become quite vigilant after being woken up. She roamed the entire train car and even the other passengers, most of which were asleep. Thief jumped up onto the empty part of the seat where the stallion was sitting. He looked over to her and blinked. She had found a cookie and decided to eat it near someone familiar. The stallion rolled his eyes and continued to stare out the window, giving a slight smile.
"It was a rat. I told you so,"
a young voice said, breaking the silence of the train cart, but not loud enough to wake any of the sleeping passengers. The stallion looked over and flinched when he saw 2 small ponies, a colt and a filly, looking at Thief.
"Ew, it's so gross. Kill it."
The filly said to the colt as she backed away a step, looking disgusted at the rodent who had stolen her treat. The colt looked to the rat and smiled.
"I'm not gonna kill it. It's cool,"
he said, admiring her shiny coat and adoring the way she nibbled on the cookie.
"But those things carry diseases. That's how they all died. Disease from those things. Just keep it away, Teddy, please."
The filly pleaded to her brother, worried that she would lose him to disease too.
"That guy's not scared of it."
The colt looked towards the stallion in the booth that quickly looked away and back out the window. His ears dropped. The filly's attention went to the stranger examining him. From what she could see, that wasn't covered by cloth or leather, his coat was a golden brown, his nose was a much darker color, and he had a very short mane. The top was completely white, while the sides were black. His eyes were a shade of dark blue, intense, and he was almost glistening in the dull light of the train.
Hey, mister, how come you're so shiny?
she asked. Almost immediately after the question, the stallion picked up the thief, put her back onto his shoulder, and pulled his hood up, trying to hide from the children. The sweet lay half-eaten on the seat.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you.
She put her ears back and said apologetic, surprised at the stranger's reaction to her simple question. Her brother picked up the half-eaten cookie and took a bite.
See? He picked up the rat. It's not poisonous, dummy.
The colt happily chewed the treat with his mouth open, trying to gross out his older sister. The filly snatched the cookie out of her brother's hoof and set it back on the seat.
Rats aren't poisonous. They carry deadly diseases, dummy.
After she retorted her comeback at her brother, she turned back to the stranger.
Look, mister, I'm sorry for calling your rat diseased.
The strange pony kept his glance out the window. The rat, however, was trying to find her way out of his hood and back to her treat. The stallion put a hoof in front of his tiny friend to keep her from going back to the children, and in that same moment his ears perked up with the familiar sound of the squealing brakes of the train. Canterlot, a pristine city where the wealthy thrive regardless of the war outside their massive wall. Guard ponies roamed everywhere to keep the crime, and slave ponies, in their place. The filly and colt backed up as the stallion slid out of his seat, the partially eaten cookie still lying on the cushion.
There you two are.
The hooded stallion turned around to look behind him and saw a bright green stallion with a brown mane and tail yelling at the kids.
Do you want me to put the chains back on you? Get back here right now, or I'm going to have you two marked the second we get there.
The kids slunk down in place, terrified of this adult pony. They whimpered for a second before hurrying back to where they were originally sitting. The green stallion gave the stranger a mean look before he continued after the filly and colt. The cloaked stallion twitched his tail as he watched the three ponies walk away before he got off the train. With his ears back, he looked about the proud city. No ponies dying in the streets, no flea-bitten animals roaming around, and no slaves outside of their cages. Due to the number of guard ponies the city sported, it wasn't a city he fancied to steal from, but he knew its layout well enough to avoid the larger gatherings of them. Leaving the train station, he ducked down an alleyway that led to a small canal. This water didn't have any life-threatening monsters in it, but it did have a few fish swimming around, so he knew it was safe to wade into. He stepped in as quietly as he could manage to not upset the still water. Before submerging his entire body, he let Thief go on top of his head before he went almost all the way underwater. He wanted to make sure she didn't get wet. He swam through the calm, hoof-built river, past a few buildings and under a guarded bridge, making sure to stay out of any spotlight. As he got to a fork in the canal, he stopped and held onto the wall. Looking up, he could see a guard pony standing and observing the pathway above. The stallion unlatched the bow from his leather vest harness that was underneath his cloak and pulled out an arrow from the quiver attached on the opposite side. He gently kicked off a bit from the wall while aiming above the guard pony's head. The arrow shot out and attached itself onto a windowsill that led into a darkened room. The rope dangled down from the arrow. He buried himself in water once more and waited. Neither the guard pony nor whoever lived in the house stirred. Satisfied that no pony heard the arrow thud onto the wood, he took a hoof and grabbed the rope. The stallion looked up at the guard pony before slowly lifting himself out of the water, keeping a constant eye on the warden. He reached the windowsill and climbed in. The room was dark with the pungent smell of old dust lingering in the room. This home hadn't been used in years. There was nothing in it but a bed of straw, an old dresser, and an unused candle. Nothing to value the intruder. He continued on to a windowsill that was on the adjacent side of the room from where he came in and peered out. Just down the road was his destination. He watched, waiting to see more guard ponies, but none came. The stallion was a very patient pony and would wait an hour just to be safe. Watching, waiting, learning the guard pony's appointed path of travel. There was only one lookout. He walked past the front of the mansion only once in the hour that the stallion waited. He must walk around the entire property by himself. No other ponies were outside at posts. How strange. Knowing the sun would rise within the next hour, he had to act now or wait another day. The stallion was patient, but not that patient. He climbed out of the window and looked up. The roof was just within Hoof's reach. He climbed up and looked around. The guard pony that was next to the canal had fallen asleep, so it was safe for him to walk on the path below. But he wanted to be sure he wasn't going to get caught. The stallion jumped onto the nearest roof and continued on. Luckily, the majority of the residences were all connected together, confined to fit as many ponies as possible in one space. A couple more rope arrows provided the stallion within reach of the stable that belonged to the auctioneer. With no pony in sight, He dug his last rope arrow into the side of the building he stood on and slid down it. Now he just had to get inside of the wall. He wasn't exactly sure when the guard pony would be back because he didn't wait around long enough to find out, but he knew that he would be coming from the left side, so the hooded stallion trotted to the right. Not too far, he found an apple cart set up to sell goods that was just tall enough for him to reach the top of the wall. He climbed on top of the small wagon's roof and peered over the stone structure. No spotlights, but there were 2 guard ponies. Luckily, they looked a bit tired from staying up all night. The stallion climbed atop the wall and clopped along it. He didn't see any others stationed around the fancy building. He felt it odd that the unicorn in the barn informed the palace was well defended, but he shoved it to the back of his mind, focusing on his target. Below him were some bushes that would provide adequate cover from the guards. He dropped down next to the shrubbery and sank low. Putting a hoof to Thief, he gently nudged her awake.
Okay, buddy. Time to find the shiny.
He whispered to the rat as he pulled his tiny companion carefully out of his hood. The rat cleaned her face before looking up at her master. He nudged her gently with his nose, and she scurried away towards the barn. As he walked along the bushes in search of a way to get into the barn for himself, his cloak began to get caught on the branches, rustling the leaves. The guard ponies' ears perked up, and they turned to the direction of the sound.
You heard that, right?
One guard pony said to the other.
Not sure?
The other pony said, trying to think clearly. He believed it was lack of sleep messing with his mind.
Well, I know I heard something. Better make sure one of the slaves didn't dig themselves out again,
he replied before starting to walk in the direction of the bush. When he reached the hedges, he looked around, pushing them out of the way to see behind and in between them. Nothing.
Maybe it was just that damn raccoon again,
he said disappointingly before returning to his post. The stallion hid behind a crate, his cloak hidden, balled up under the same bush that claimed it. He looked around and found a safe passage to the side of the barn. Walking around to the back, he found a spot where a couple of the sideboards were broken. He put his nose to the hole. It was just big enough for his head, but not his whole body. He continued around the barn and spotted a window at the top. Nothing to climb up to it, though. His ears went back. He continued around until he could see the guard ponies again, but found no other entrances. He quietly trotted back to the broken side and looked in. Moldy straw and manure could be seen along with other odd shapes in the darkness, most likely slave ponies huddled together in the frosty night air. And something moving. Thief scurried to the stallion with something in her mouth. He stepped back and let her out. He took the object from her and examined it. It was a rock, possibly a shard of something, maybe uncut diamonds. He couldn't tell, but he wanted it. All of it. He had to have it, whatever it was. Thief ran back into the barn, the stallion knowing from his companion's leave that there was more to be had. The stallion had to get what was inside. He needed those shiny rocks. The stallion went back to the side with the guards and pulled out one of his arrows. Still hidden, he aimed at the metal sign across the way, well past the guard ponies. He pulled back the string and let go. Twang! The sign cried out as it was struck with the arrow. The guard ponies knew they weren't imagining that sound and ran towards it, ready to take down any intruders. Now, with no pony in the way of the entrance, the stallion entered the stables. The pungent stench of excrement and body fluids was enough to put a shudder down the stallion's spine, but he carried on. Thief came back to him with another stone in her mouth, and just like with the first stone, he put this one in his saddlebags. She ran off to the back corner, and the stallion followed. She led him to a pile of shadows all huddled together, the slaves. He knew he had to stay quiet or fear waking them, but Thief had already done that. A little colt smiled as he petted her, happy that she returned. 2 other ponies were awake and staring at the stranger who had entered their holding pen. A female unicorn used her weak magic to make a small light to try to see who it was. The glow of her horn illuminated against the stallion's glistening coat and brightened the room even further. He took a step back, and the same moment the awake slaves huddled closer together and away from the intruder. The other adult pony was a Pegasus, light tan color with a white mane and tail. His wings were poorly clipped, and dried blood still clung to what was left of his wings. Aside from their many other scars, each of them had a clear mark on their flanks right where their cutie marks would be. 3 scars that overlapped each other, making a distinct letter S, identifying them as slaves. The beaten Pegasus gingerly spoke to the intruder.
Who are you? You're not gonna to hurt us, are you?
He was obviously terrified and had the most scars out of the 3 whom the intruder could see. The stallion weighed his options. Normally, slaves ask for help or freedom when they can if they see an unfamiliar face. The stallion didn't have a habit of playing hero, and he wasn't interested in starting. Neither was he interested in getting himself caught and becoming shackled next to them. He knew the consequences if he became a slave, or at least he thought he did, and he didn't want any part of it. He put his ears back. He knew he had to threaten these ponies to keep them quiet. He hated hearing the whimpered cries and beggings of a slave pony, and he didn't want to hear it now.
I'm a slave pony murderer, and if you don't do as I say, the young colt is going to be my next victim.
He lied as he stared at the colts and gave a slight grin. The slaves shuddered and huddled even closer together, the unicorn mare trying to hide the young colt.
My friend found these, and I want them,
the stallion said as he brought one of the shiny rocks out from his saddlebags. The unicorn mare pointed in the direction of the corner, and the stallion followed her direction. Thief popped out of the straw, the only clean pile in the barn, with another shiny rock in her mouth. After tucking it away in his saddlebag, he dug around the straw and found a box. Thief had gnawed a hole in the corner of the box as an entrance for herself, but the stallion didn't have any way to get in without unlocking it. He took 2 long metal objects from the black bands around his forelegs and began to pick the lock. With his expertise, it was easy enough to open and reveal the treasure inside. He stared at it for a moment, admiring its beauty before he heard the guards outside returning to their posts.
Fuck,
he whispered to himself, his exit now blocked. After putting all the contents of the box into his saddlebags, he looked around. The slave ponies were still huddled together, the unicorn's light dimming from exhaustion and terror. He spotted the open window at the top. It was still too high for him to reach, and nothing to get on top of to reach it. Unless... His gaze turned back to the slave ponies, the unicorn in particular.
levitate me.
He commanded. Levitate you? The unicorn frightfully asked.
Yes, up to that window. I can get down from there.
But The mare shook her head. I can't. I'm not strong enough, and I never really learned any spells to...
Then wake some pony else who can,
the stallion said frustratingly, almost loud enough for the guards to hear and think it was more than just night terrors from one of the slaves. The Pegasus woke another pony. This one was a Pegasus mare. She was in pristine condition for a slave, and hadn't even had the S carved into her flank yet. The unicorn quietly explained to the Pegasus mare before she nodded. Her wings were torn, but not nearly as bad as the stallion's had been. While the slaves whispered to each other, Thief crawled up onto the stallion's leg and back to her sleeping spot on his neck. I can fly, but not very well. Plumlick said she'd try to help us, the mare said, referring to the unicorn. She spread her wings and went to the air. She was very wobbly, but was able to manage herself. She picked up the intruder stallion and began to lift him into the air. She struggled to go higher. Every second took forever in the stallion's mind, and he had to get out of there before the sun rose and some pony came to get the slaves. With what little help the unicorn could provide, they finally made it to the window and the stallion grabbed onto it. He lifted himself up as the Pegasus gratefully stood on solid ground once more. Not taking any looks back to the slaves, the intruder made his escape.